So first things first, some folks have been emailing Kevin about sending their journals. You're supposed to keep that all in one document and then email that to him at the week of the midterm and the week of the final. Yeah?
No, sorry, there's a flag.
Oh. So keep that all in one document, 100 words a week. So today we're talking about when Europe finally started actually coming over to what would later be the United States. But the nature of this, European colonization, is heavily debated among historians, even to this day. There's a new trend of using the term settler colonialism. Can anybody tell me what that is? Nobody? So it's kind of in the term that settlers come across the sea and basically try to replace the indigenous population. Unlike where we see colonialism elsewhere, like Africa, where it was heavily based on like mineral extraction and resource extraction, here it was much more about settlement. But you'll find historians who disagree with that interpretation. So even the very nature of European colonialism is heavily debated. So keep that in mind, because we're going to see many different countries taking very different approaches. The difference between Spain, France, Netherlands, and of course Britain are entirely different approaches to how they settled the New World. But also, there were a lot of false starts. The first of which very much was a false start. There was a movement towards coming to what is now called Newfoundland, though they called it Vinland. And this was essentially the first time that Europeans came to North America's shores. But they also didn't leave a lasting impression. So there's also a possibility that, though we call these people Vikings, it would be more accurate to call them Norsemen, because Viking is actually a something that you do, going out on raids. It doesn't actually refer to an ethnicity. So the Norsemen are the first ones that we know of, but there's actually a possibility that some, what would later be called, what the Norsemen called Papirs, basically popish people, as in Christians, possibly came all the way across the sea before them, basically from Ireland. We know that they had made it all the way to Iceland at some point, because there is archaeological evidence of this and also oral histories of Irish people making it to Iceland. The question is, did they go any further? Did they get to Greenland? Did they get to Newfoundland? We don't know. There's also a bunch of legends about Welsh kings who came across the sea and stuff like that. Nothing archaeologically to back up any of these claims. But it's interesting to note that there might have been European travel across the sea even before the Norsemen. So for instance, in 512, St. Brendan Island was charted in a map, and there's some speculation that that could have been Iceland, but there's also some speculation that it could have been Newfoundland. But eventually, the Norsemen came to Iceland, first colonized in 874 AD by, I'm going to butcher this name and all of these names because I cannot speak Icelandic, but Ingolfur Arnarsson. Don't bother trying to remember these names. But quickly, even Iceland started to get overwhelmed. And by the 980s, about a century later, they're already having to push people away. So, for instance, the next big movement was with this guy named Eric the Red, known as the Red because of his red beard. But he was a serial murderer, just fun guy. And he got told to leave the colony. And so instead of heading back east, he headed west. Now there had been some former sailors who had supposedly found land to the west by, basically the way that they would navigate is by the stars, and sometimes they just got blown off course. And this guy named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson, told you I'm going to butcher these names, was somebody in the around 970s, about a decade prior to Eric the Red, who had professed to have found a large mass of land. And he said that it was forested. So probably not Greenland, actually. Now, mind you, these are all stories that are relayed over centuries. These are all from what is called oral history, where basically a story is relayed through generations of just reciting it as if it's like a poem, and then eventually, a couple centuries later, some enterprising priest decides to write it all down, and that's how we get these stories. So keep in mind how much distance we have from actual fact. But in the 970s, Eric the Red made it to Greenland, and set up a colony there. Well, now I'm getting that fly. Can anybody guess why they called it the first island Iceland and the next one Greenland?
So that way Greenland would be more appealing to go, even though it's just ice?
Yeah. Iceland is a lot more green than Greenland, but, it already had that name. And Greenland was basically named for marketing purposes to get people to come to the island. Now, mostly people were using it to set up small settlements, and the meager amount of trees that were there were being used for lumbering. And they'd take that back to Iceland and sometimes all the way back to Norway. But eventually, even that gets really deforested really quickly, because there's not much forest on Greenland, right? It's mostly glacier. So eventually, Eric the Red's son had to had to find a new colony in the islands that they had previously found just south of Greenland. The main one being that they called it Vinland because it looked like it had grapevines. And this guy's name was Leif Erikson, as in Eric the Red's son. Leif Erikson, somewhere around 1000 AD, landed in Newfoundland, and but then set up a small colony. It was tiny, just a few huts. We know that this actually happened because because archaeologists have actually recently found the settlement. It's on Newfoundland and just on the northern tip. It was found in the 1990s. So a lot of people thought that this was all kind of a legend, something that, because there's a lot of these kinds of mystic islands, like Atlantis and stuff like that, where people say that there's some island out in the Atlantic and then make up big stories about it. And a lot of people thought that that was the case for the Norsemen, until finally they found the settlement. And as the story goes, they kept on running into what they called Skraelings. Now, Skraeling just means little people, and to a Norseman, basically everyone looks like little people. And that was their term for American Indians, or up there they call them First Nations. And these Skraelings started getting into fights with the Norsemen, and eventually basically kicked them off the island by force. And famously, what's pictured here is you can see that there's a woman reaching down for a sword. Supposedly, this shield maiden, who is, it's not actually a shield maiden, but the stories always call her a shield maiden, grabbed up the sword and managed to defend the colony long enough for everyone to get to the boats on her own. It's obviously just a story, but what's interesting is that they continued to use Vinland for timbering all the way until 1347. So probably that whole story and what this painting is based on is probably not actually true. But, if it's a good story, you got to tell it. But yes, in 1347, that's when the last time we see lumbering operations in the New World. Somewhere around then is when the Norsemen abandoned the colony even in Greenland. And so it's right around 1400 is when they abandoned that, which interestingly enough, literally at the end of that century is when Europeans would again menace the shores of the New World. But first, you have to understand why. Because this is a map of Europe in 1500, and what's interesting about the time frame is that Christopher Columbus, who was the one who would eventually, of course, sail the ocean blue, was sailing for these folks right here when Castile and Aragon formally united under two crowns by marriage of the two monarchs. But same year as Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, there was actually a kingdom right here that was a Muslim kingdom that was remaining from when Muslims conquered a good chunk of the Spanish peninsula, and finally in 1492 they were defeated, completing what's called the Reconquista. And it literally is the same year that Columbus sailed. But as you can see, Europe looks a lot different than it does today, right? France is this tiny little jam of its former of what it is today. England is not united with any other kingdoms, and you've got this big old mass of what's called the Holy Roman Empire, which is neither Holy Roman nor an empire, but really just made up of a bunch of United States, of United Kingdoms, principalities, duchies, all kinds of different states, all constantly bickering and warring with each other. So it's not really a singular place. But what's most important on this map is this, the Ottoman Empire. Because something that really pushed Columbus out across the ocean was that. So in 1453, the Ottomans conquered what's this little sliver right here, and that's called was called Constantinople. Nowadays, is called Istanbul, and it was really the last vestige of the old Roman Empire, but we call it the Byzantine Empire. And up until that point, people could travel the Silk Road by going through that kingdom, and often traveling rather freely across what the Ottomans had previously conquered, the old Mongol Empire. And the Silk Road was easy to travel. It had less fares to deal with, and once the Ottomans took over, it meant that you could no longer do that. People were constantly afraid of losing access to China. And that's really what pushed Columbus out across the Atlantic, was trying to find a new route to China. Hence why he would mistakenly call the islands that he landed in India. Even before that, there was constantly fighting with the Ottomans. For instance, there was the siege of Vienna in 1521. Now that's obviously later, but I don't have any dates for that. But a Holy League was formed specifically to fight the Ottomans, and it became a huge part of politics in Europe, was figuring out ways of trying to deal with this Ottoman menace. So eventually that culminated in 1571 with the naval battle of Lepanto, one of the biggest naval battles in history, and where finally Naples and the rest of the Holy League was managed to keep the Mediterranean Christian. But up until that point, it was very much an open question. And this caused a huge change in the way that people were dealing with writing to each other and diplomacy. So a lot of the old Byzantine officials ended up going to Italy, and with them they brought a lot of lost and or abandoned works of ancient writing. So there was like a rediscovery of Plato and Aristotle and stuff like that, which really kicked off the Renaissance. Now, I don't think we really need to go too deep into what the Renaissance was, but essentially it was a flourishing of art, what's called Renaissance humanism, as in a new form of writing. Just a lot of philosophical change. Because up until this point, basically, that's what we call medieval times, because the church just ruled everything. It also is the start of Florentine banking. Now, Florentine banking. And right at the same time as Christopher Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, was right at the beginning of what's called the Italian Wars, which started up in 1494, didn't end for a half century. And it's also a time where the church is making a lot from this sudden influx of art and scholarship. And so the church started trying to basically be greedy, and started using this old way of raising money called indulgences. Now, indulgences are essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card, but instead of jail, it's hell. You pay for getting rid of your sin. And some monk up in Germany who happened to be visiting Rome at the time took major issue with this. That guy's name was Martin Luther. And in 1517, he nailed 95 theses to the door of his local chapel, complaining about this and the various other corruptions of the bad popes. Because these popes were folks like the Borgias and the Medicis, much more concerned with debauchery and making money than holy worship. And so, unlike previous times when people had kind of rebelled against the church, people like Huss and the Westerites, this time it stuck, because the Medici Pope at the time was much more concerned with keeping everything peaceful so that that indulgence money could keep flowing into the coffers. Unfortunately for him, that trying to debate Martin Luther by sending folks to talk to him, such as the 1521 Diet of Worms, Worms as in Worms, Germany, Worms, didn't manage to convince Martin Luther to stop complaining. And that's really where we see a break from the church. So, because Martin Luther was protesting, we call these folks Protestants. And, of course, this started what's called the Reformation. Now, all of this doesn't really have a bearing on Christopher Columbus, and we'll get to him, but it's important to see what's going on in Europe with all of this. Now, with the Reformation, this gives another impetus to start sending people to the New World, mainly on pilgrimage. As the Reformation quickly started breaking into many, many, many other faiths other than just Lutherans, there were Anabaptists, what would later be called Unitarians, but especially Calvinists. And John Calvin, the guy who was kind of founded his own little fiefdom, came up with his own radical way of interpreting the Bible that became the main way that most of the pilgrims that came to New England and that would believe in. These radicals would be known as Puritans because they believed in purifying the church. Now, we don't need to get into all the specific theology of this stuff, but do keep in mind things like double predestination and that, because those words will come up, but at this time, we don't need to get into it. The main thing with Protestantism is there are what's called the five sola, as in sola, the Latin word to buy something alone. So like you had sola scriptura, as in by scripture alone. Sola fide, as by faith alone. Sola gratia, or by grace alone. Sola Christo, through Christ alone. Sola Deo, gloria, by the glory of God alone. So these five sola are the main thing that you have to remember when talking about Protestantism, and it's a very different view from Catholicism, where Catholicism is much more about authority of the priesthood, of the clergy. Here they're saying like anybody can interpret the Bible, anybody can read the Bible, and mind you, this is a time when the Bible's only in Latin, but quickly, folks like Martin Luther translate the Bible into local dialects, German, English, all that kind of stuff. What's called the Vulgate. And these fueled constant need to, because you could translate it yourself, you could read it yourself, you could interpret it yourself, new types of new types of Protestantism arose constantly. It was fracturing all over the place. And very quickly, we saw wars in Europe over religion. So in 1524, German peasants rose to fight for their own freedoms, and in fact, Martin Luther denounced them. It got really crazy in 1535 during the Munster Rebellion, where you basically have folks who are proposing like super orgies, and polygamy and all that kind of fun stuff. And that rebellion got put down real hard, with its leaders having their skin ripped apart and then thrown up on the church's window for all to see until they melted away. Not a fun time. The wars of religion would continue well into the 17th century and would constantly be another impetus for people to come across the sea. You see, the more strife that happens in Europe, the more reason people find to come to the New World. And finally, there's Anglicanism that arose under King Henry VIII, basically because he wanted to divorce his wife and the Pope wouldn't grant an annulment, because in Catholicism, at the time, you couldn't get divorced, period. But you could have your marriage annulled. And though he had been awarded the title Defender of the Faith by that very Pope when he had denounced Martin Luther, he ended up creating his own church called the Anglican Church, English church. And that break happened in 1529. Then there was a series of upheavals in Britain over whether or not Catholicism would come back. For instance, his daughter, Mary, came to be known as Bloody Mary when she ruled because she tried to bring back Catholicism and severely punished Protestants. Her sister, Queen Elizabeth, eventually basically secured the Protestantism in England, though there would be a series of rebellions a civil war actually in the 17th century, basically over the fact that the next king would found a new dynasty rather than the Tudors, which Henry VII was the founder of, and Queen Elizabeth would be the last. But the Stuart kings were Catholic. And so this caused even more strife going all the way into the 17th century. Until finally there was the Glorious Revolution of the late 17th century that finally secured England as a Protestant stronghold for good. So you got to realize, with all this strife, there's more reasons to go across the sea. There are also monarchical rivalries. So, for instance, France and Britain, England at this time, were constantly at each other's throat. They'd been fighting each other for half a millennium at this point. And the longest amount of peace up until the 16th century between those two kingdoms was 20 years during what we call the 100 Years' War. So people who wanted to expand their power in that by having bigger and bigger colonies in the New World. So that's another reason. They also had the Habsburg dynasty in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire and Austria. And the Habsburgs were constantly bickering with France as well. So you have these three giants trying to maintain power and one-up each other, basically, by taking more land in the New World. And finally, there's the Reconquista that completed in 1492, finally taking back the entire Iberian Peninsula from the Moors, which had started as long ago as 711 AD. So they'd been fighting over that for nearly a millennium. And anybody who was Muslim at the time in Spain had to face a new threat after this conquest called the Spanish Inquisition. And the Inquisition basically made sure that everyone converted to Catholicism and maintained that faith. So it also expressly attacked Jews and even sometimes Protestants. But people basically had to swear that they were truly Catholic, and an inquisitor could ask you questions and torture you if need be, in order to make sure that you are Catholic. This also created the Kingdom of Portugal, this Reconquista, and so there was a rivalry between the Habsburg Spain and the Portuguese kingdom. Now, King Henry the Navigator of Portugal decided, dealing with all this kinds of stuff in Europe, dealing with like the Ottomans, and possibly losing control of the Silk Road, he wanted to find a way to get to China without going through Ottoman territory, or possibly through Ottoman waters. So he started having folks go south. And, it's Prince Henry the Navigator. And he started doing this stuff in 1419, so that's before even the fall of Constantinople. And in 1479, the Treaty of, I'm going to butcher this name, Alcacovas. You don't need to remember it, just remember that there was a treaty in 1479 that divided the Atlantic, saying that basically for Spain, they could try going west of a certain line, whereas for the Portuguese, they got to control Africa. And eventually, they would make it all the way down the coast. Let's see here. Yeah, in 1488, Bartolome Diaz rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope. And in 1498, Vasco da Gama made it all the way to India. So Spain needed to have an answer to what Portugal was having. Because remember, they're right here, and these two kingdoms are united. Remember that. But Portugal's right there. If they're making money by going all the way around Africa, and Spain's not allowed to go around Africa, what's their answer? Send some kooky guy across the Atlantic and see what he can find. Now, up until this point, nobody really knew that there was an entire continent in between that. But Columbus believed that he could reach what is now called Japan within the amount of provisions that it would take to sail all the way across. Nobody had attempted this because most people considered you couldn't make it that far, given the amount of provisions that you could carry on a ship. But also Columbus kind of underestimated where Japan was by a couple thousand miles. But that's more because of faulty maps than, bad math. The guy wasn't dumb, though you will hear people call him that. He was violent, though. Let's see here. So, in April of 1492, he was granted the right to 1/10 of the riches of anyone who used this particular route, or any new lands that were found. So he formed a fleet of 3 ships, one called the Nina, one called the Pinta, and the other one was the Santa Maria. By the way, Pinta actually isn't the real name. It's just how it was painted. Pinta just means painted. And so they left in August of 1492. And made it across all the way to the Caribbean by October. So realize they left in August and landed in October. That's 2 months that it took to make that voyage. Imagine if they had to go all the way to Japan and the New World simply didn't exist. Probably would have died. But instead, they landed in, let's see here. They landed in the Caribbean, setting up a short-lived garrison that they called La Navidad in what is now Haiti. He got back in March of 1493, but landed in Portugal. And there was a bunch of issues with that. Couldn't go back all the way until September of 1493, which this was an actual colonization attempt with 17 ships. Let's see here. These, I forgot to say, capitulations of Santa Fe is the contract that that Columbus made with the Spanish crown, and so in September of 1493 he left with 17 ships, and arrived in the Caribbean in November. Notice, still a 2-month voyage at this point. This time founded a much more long-lasting colony called La Isabela, named after the Queen, which it failed eventually, but lasted for 7 years. They started imposing their will on natives at this point. Basically, Columbus imposed what is called a tithing. And he said for anyone who was near the colony, they had to bring X amount of gold, and would be severely punished if they didn't. This could get as bad as cutting off people's hands. And he instituted a truly bloody reign in the La Isabela. But he quickly had to go back to try to find more colonies. At this point, he's basically in command of all Spanish people in the New World. But in 1500, that was no longer the case. At first he tried to have his son appointed, but then another person named Francisco de Bobadilla, I'm sorry for butchering all of these names, was appointed, and he immediately got a bunch of complaints from local Spanish people about Columbus's cruel control. And Columbus was jailed that year in Spain, specifically because of his cruelty in the New World. So he had actually had some. Oh no, that's 1502. But he eventually was allowed to make a final voyage, the fourth time trying to circumnavigate the globe, but ended up not even making it past the Americas because his crew mutinied and then left him in Jamaica for, I do not have the dates on that, but they literally stranded him on Jamaica for a while because they didn't like him so much, his own crew. So, truly a cruel, cruel man. And the circumnavigation of the globe wouldn't happen until 1519 with Magellan. Well, it wouldn't be completed until 1522. And Magellan wouldn't even make it all the way through. But this is the first time we actually have a permanent colony in the New World, right? So the Spanish started trying to have totally different forms of labor. So the first time that they tried to do it was with that tithing of Columbus. Didn't work out so well. Especially cutting off the hands of your workers is generally not considered a good way to keep them working. So the Spanish took their medieval system called the encomienda, which is basically the manorial system where you have serfs and who are bound to the land, and you have lords who control that. Well, they tried to impose that on local Indians. That too didn't work out so well and was abolished by 1542 with the new laws of the Indies. And in 1501, though there had already been some trade in slaves, in 1501, Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Castile and Aragon, Spain, gave dispensation to start importing slaves from Africa. So this is the start of the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, I mean. And it was basically for labor. You know, as the encomienda system wasn't working out so well, they figured they could import slaves rather than trying to enslave natives. Let's see here. And in 1503, they began relocation of Indians into congregations, basically forced conversions. This was called reducing them to Christianity. So they were reducing them from their wild ways. Then you have, and that became voluntary in the 1520s as the beginning of the mission system, where basically you had missions that would offer, housing and modern conveniences for conversion to Christianity. People who were on these missions were called neophytes. But that also provided another form of labor, reducing natives to Christianity meant that they also had to work on these missions. You see how this whole system is building up around basically resource extraction or resource production. A lot of it in the early years was mining or farming. You can't really transport stuff back, but farming can keep feeding the miners. Let's see here. And then we have one of the people who went over to push this entire conversion, one of the priests, this guy named Bartolome de las Casas, who was actually given a encomienda at first. He gave it up in 1515 and started campaigning for better treatment of Indians. He wrote a lot about how Spain was mistreating the natives. And so Casas, in 1552, wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which popularized the realization that the Spanish had been cruelly treating natives across the New World. So when Columbus started all of this, it was purely a way of profiting, right? He was originally assigned 1/10 the riches of the New World. And he would actually sue the crown to get some of those riches in his later life after having been jailed and everything. The discovery of new lands like this became a hot-button issue back in Europe and quickly had to be decided by the Pope, who decided to keep that treaty split that came back in the mid-15th century. And in 1494, a treaty split the Atlantic again, this time making a clear line that said anything on to the east of that line is Portuguese, anything west of that line is Spanish. All new lands. So the first version of that was specifically so that Portugal could maintain control of the route around Africa. This was to maintain control of lands. But in 1500, there was land in the New World discovered that was within the Portuguese sector. Then we have, and so somebody who was sent to deal with these new lands and map them out and kind of negotiate where this line was a guy named Amerigo Vespucci. And Amerigo proclaimed that in 1499 proclaimed that there was enough evidence to say that there was an entirely new continent simply from runoff of the Amazon River. In 1501 through 02, he participated in colonization and the mapping of Brazil, and popularized the notion of this new world, new continents. Now, unlike what's popularly thought, eventually Columbus actually did believe that there were new continents. On his third voyage, he actually had landed in what is modern-day Colombia, and Panama. So at that point, he was pretty sure that there were new continents. In fact, what Amerigo Vespucci first called North America was Colombia. That's why we have, things like the District of Columbia and that. But eventually, both continents took on the mapper's name, and that's where we get the term America. North America and South America are just named after Amerigo Vespucci. And especially because of Columbus getting marooned in Jamaica, that's why Amerigo became the term for America, because Columbus could no longer popularize it. He wasn't exactly popular with anybody he worked with or the people that he dominated. Spain wasn't exactly satisfied with just a bunch of islands off the coast of these new continents. And so in the early 16th century, they started trying to conquer the mainland. Let's see here. Now, in 1517, they sent the Cordoba expedition trying to fight the Maya on the Yucatan Peninsula. That didn't exactly go well. As I said, there's a lot of false starts with all of this. In 1519, Hernan Cortez landed in what is now Mexico. And mind you, this is a private expedition formed specifically to conquer, just basically the same way that Columbus had been given the contract for 1/10 the riches. This too was under a similar contract, though Hernan Cortez was kind of going rogue, and instead of dealing with the other colonies or possibly people defecting, he burnt his ships behind him so that all the people that were with him had to continue and conquer the Aztec Empire. And so by forming alliances with locals and that, they managed to actually make a very strong foothold there. Even in 1521, taking the most populous city in the Americas, Tenochtitlan, which is now called Mexico City. The term Mexico just simply comes from the people there. The Mexicans originally refers to people of the Mexico Valley, which is Aztecs, and the various alliances, various other allied cultures with the Aztecs. Because if you remember from last lecture, the Aztec Empire was formed by 3 city-states coming together. But they had reached from sea to shining sea at this point. And so in 1521, with the conquest of Tenochtitlan, they finally were able to put a strong foothold in the New World. This conquest came at the cost of massacring thousands, by the way. But, that's how the Spanish do. And in 1524, the Council of the Indies was established, which would essentially be the main power in what would become called New Spain. For some reason, Europeans weren't very creative with their names. They just always called it New something or another. We'll deal later with New France, New Netherlands, New England, because they just don't have a good way of naming things, apparently. And then eventually Spain started trying to come into what is now the United States. So first in 1517, Ponce de Leon discovered Florida and explored a little bit of the Virginia coast. In 1520, Esteban Gomez explored the entirety of what is now the U.S. East Coast. In 1527, there was a expedition that landed in Florida under the command of Narvaez, and they made it all the way to what is now Sonora, Mexico. And then finally in 1539, Hernan de Soto landed in Florida, but made it much further into the interior. This expedition managed to run into some of those mound builders that we were talking about in the last lecture. And ended up getting in numerous fights, and at some point around Texas today, the expedition broke up. Some tried to sail, some tried to walk. And this expedition started going all the way into what is today New Mexico. And supposedly these three wanderers managed to see what they called the Seven Cities of Gold, or Cibola. Through that information, a expedition was arranged to come up into New Mexico, what is now New Mexico, obviously, under a guy named Coronado. And he left in 1540, ended up getting in a bunch of fights with the Puebloans here. Actually ended up stopping just north of here, which you can still go visit the ruins of that Pueblo today. Eventually they told him that there was another big city out on the Great Plains. Left, found out that there wasn't really anything there, strangled their guide, and came back and made it all the way back down to Mexico. In the process, he had burned 3 pueblos and killed hundreds upon hundreds of Puebloans. But this was how the Spanish would conquer territories, is that they would come and break local native power by conquest. But in the case of Coronado, that didn't really work out. Also, around the same time, in 1542, Juan Cabrillo led an expedition by sea to go all the way up the Californian coast. So at this point, by the 1540s, the Spanish basically have mapped the entire U.S. coast and made it deep into the interior. But it wasn't until the 1560s that they managed to make a strong hold in what is now the United States. In 1562, some French Huguenots tried to set up what they called Fort Caroline in Florida. this was a bit of an upset because, of course, Spain claimed it. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. And so in return, the Spanish founded St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. And in the process, they marched over to St. Caroline and massacred 700 Frenchmen to maintain that territory. And 1565 is the mark of the beginning of this colony, but St. Augustine is also the oldest city in the United States today. But the Spanish would also create New Mexico, where we are right now. In 1598, they sent Juan de Oñate into New Mexico to create the colony. He tried to keep the Puebloans from rebelling like they did under Coronado's time, but eventually he came to Acoma and found the because if you've ever been to Acoma, it's up on a mountain, and they had captured some Spanish. Well, they were supposed to be negotiators, but possibly they had committed a murder or something along those lines in Acoma. In either case, when he was riding up to it, he found his delegation being dangled off the cliff just in time to be thrown off, including one of which was his son. You can guess from all this brutality that we've seen with the Spanish, they're quite willing to resort to brutality. But you throw a guy's son off of a cliff, suddenly that brutality gets amped up to 11, right? So he quickly conquered Acoma and had all males of a certain age have their left foot amputated as punishment. The estimates can go from 200 dead to 1,000, and the same number of amputees. So, despite that brutality, he somehow managed to clamp down and create New Mexico, which lasted all the way until 1680, when the Pueblos rebelled again, but this time successfully. But we'll get to that in another lecture. It wouldn't be until the 1690s that the Spanish started going into Texas, and it wouldn't be until the late 18th century that they finally went into California. But essentially, this is the creation of New Spain. I don't think we have enough time to go into land grants, but essentially land grants were how the Spanish distributed property. So we have a little bit of time left. Figured we don't have much time to do a discussion or anything, but any questions? Remember what I said in that discussion on Thursday, that your midterm and your final are going to be expressly about trying to find significance. So with the little bit of time that we have left, can anybody tell me why it's important to understand what was going on in Europe with before getting to all of this stuff?
It influences how people think when they're going to the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It means that they have a particular mentality. Anyone else? Think about like, why were they coming to the New World in the first place, right? There's a push to get people away from Europe, right? Columbus wouldn't have sailed the ocean blue if it weren't for the Ottomans taking over the Byzantine Empire. There wouldn't be an impetus for basically religious colonies if there wasn't a Reformation going on in Europe. And there wouldn't be a reason for having colonies in the New World that are constantly expanding if it weren't for monarchical rivalries. So, the only reason why the New World was colonized is because of what was going on in the Old World. So keep that in mind. Those are the kinds of things that you will want to think about when you are talking about significance on the tests. What's the context, what's the meaning, that kind of thing. That's what the significance of these terms will be. You'll be identifying those terms. Any questions? All right. Well, have a good day.